War isn't what it used to be. It's no longer just the clash of swords or the roar of cannons, with a clear line between armies and civilians. Modern war is abstract, strategic, and almost always justified. Every action is weighed, every casualty calculated, every strike rationalized. And yet inside this machinery of strategy lies a question as old as civilization itself. What is just and what is merely expedient? The theory of a just war dates back centuries to thinkers like Augustine and Aquinas. They tried to place a moral compass inside the chaos of battle. Their principles demanded necessity, proportionality, and discrimination. You could only go to war for a righteous cause, only harm what was unavoidable, and only protect the innocent. These weren't laws of power, they were laws of conscience. But history shows us that conscience often bends to necessity. This is where Realpolitik comes in, the cold logic of national interest. It argues that power and survival are more important than morality. Strategy becomes an end in itself and victory becomes its own justification. The idea of the greater good can be twisted to erase the faces of the few for the sake of the many. And the more distant a conflict is, the easier it becomes to believe that ethical lines are flexible. The 20th century is a perfect testament to this tension. World War II demanded total mobilization, but the firebombing of cities and the atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki challenged every single notion of a just war. Leaders claimed it was necessary. Generals measured efficiency, and civilians paid the ultimate price. The moral line blurred under the weight of strategy, and from that blurring, Realpolitik found fertile ground. The Cold War sharpened this divide. We saw proxy wars, coups, and covert operations, all justified in the name of containment, security, or ideology. Countries were moved around like chess pieces, and ethical questions became secondary, considered only if they affected public perception. Political expediency, not moral doctrine, wrote the rules. The just war tradition was mentioned in speeches and cited in textbooks, but it rarely guided actual decisions. Yet even in all this abstraction, conscience survived. Soldiers on the ground, diplomats at negotiation tables, civilians trapped in conflict zones, they all felt the friction between principle and power. A young officer in Vietnam could question his orders, even if he couldn't escape the battlefield. A journalist in Iraq could expose atrocities without changing policy. A refugee fleeing a bombed village could demand justice without ever receiving it. Each of these moments is a reminder that when theory meets reality, reality often betrays it. In modern conflicts, this tension is glaringly visible in the use of drones, targeted strikes, and sanctions. Precision weapons promise to be discriminate, yet mistakes are inevitable. Civilians become casualties, and the architects of policy remain insulated from the human consequences. Economists and military planners talk about probabilities and risk management. Ethical philosophers talk about responsibility and moral injury. And somewhere between these two conversations, lives are lost. Suffering is measured in data and conscience is reduced to a footnote. Every leader faces this choice, to act morally or to act effectively. It's rare that both can happen at the same time. The just war framework demands restraint and a careful weighing of necessity against harm. Realpolitik demands results, survival, and maintaining power. The decisions are never simple and they're rarely clean. And yet, the world often judges success not by virtue, but by the outcome. The 2003 Iraq War is a stark illustration. Intelligence reports, claims of weapons of mass destruction, political pressure and public fear all converged to justify an invasion. The moral calculus of a just war, last resort, reasonable chance of success, proportionality, was debated, contested, and ultimately overridden. Realpolitik dictated speed, decisiveness, and a demonstration of power. The consequences were immense, often underestimated, and frequently rationalized as acceptable collateral damage. In Afghanistan, the logic of Realpolitik dominated even the noblest of intentions. The initial response to 9/11, justified as self-defense, evolved into a two-decade struggle where ethical clarity eroded, alliances shifted, and civilian suffering mounted. Soldiers and strategists privately wrestled with the tension between their orders and their conscience. Historians would later analyze and categorize the actions, but the raw human experience could never be reduced to simple metrics. So, every modern war brings us back to the same question. Can justice truly exist in the pursuit of power? Philosophers and strategists have tried to answer it, but every conflict exposes the gap between theory and practice. Just war gives us a lens to critique and aspire. Realpolitik gives us a lens to act and survive. The friction between these two creates moral ambiguity, policy debates, and the ongoing struggle to reconcile ethics with necessity. In boardrooms and battle rooms, in think tanks and parliaments, this conversation is relentless. Papers are written, doctrines are refined, principles are debated. They all ask in one way or another, what is permissible in the pursuit of security? What is unavoidable in the pursuit of power? The answers are never final. They depend on context, perspective, and history. Yet the consequences are eternal. Civilians caught in conflict, displaced populations, destroyed communities. These are not abstractions. Every sanction, every bomb, every military maneuver leaves an imprint. History remembers, even when the daily discourse forgets. The architects of Realpolitik argue that survival is the highest ethical duty of a nation, and it requires sacrifice. Morality, they say, is a luxury you can only afford when you're secure. But just war theorists counter that ethical principles are the very foundation of civilization. Abandoning them erodes legitimacy, trust, and the purpose of governance itself. Each perspective has merit, and each has peril. This tension is even visible in our digital age. Cyber warfare, artificial intelligence, targeted operations, technology amplifies our capacity, but it also reduces visibility and complicates moral judgment. Algorithms can calculate risk, but they can't feel consequence. Decisions are made in an abstract digital space, while human bodies absorb the real-world effects. The friction between ethical theory and political expediency grows ever sharper. What we're left with isn't a simple answer, but a landscape for reflection. Just war demands conscience, Realpolitik demands pragmatism. Leaders have to navigate this terrain constantly, knowing that every choice carries both moral weight and strategic consequence. Decisions that seem effective today might be condemned tomorrow. Actions justified now may haunt history forever. Perhaps the most important lesson isn't to resolve this tension, but to simply acknowledge it. Recognizing the moral ambiguity, being willing to question strategy, paying attention to the human cost, these are the signs of ethical governance in an era of unprecedented power. Awareness alone doesn't guarantee a righteous path, but it ensures that actions are considered, debated, and remembered. Throughout history, those who tried to perfectly reconcile just war and Realpolitik have often failed. Yet, each failure illuminates the path forward. They teach us that power without conscience is tyranny, and conscience without power is impotent. The challenge is to balance effectiveness with ethics, to act decisively without forsaking our humanity, and to navigate strategy without abandoning morality. In moments of quiet, when the maps are rolled up and the strategy sessions end, the question lingers. How do we act rightly in a world where power is necessary and morality can feel optional? The answer might not be found in a new law or a new technology. It might emerge in the quiet deliberation of leaders, in the teaching of soldiers and citizens, and in the acknowledgement of victims and their stories. It lives in the tension itself, the constant negotiation between what must be done and what ought to be done. Maybe that is the ultimate lesson. Moral clarity is rare, and ethical certainty is fleeting. The only path forward is through deliberate, conscious reflection. In the end, just war isn't a guide to victory, and Realpolitik isn't a prescription for morality. Both exist as mirrors, one reflecting our conscience, the other reflecting our power. It's up to us, as observers, historians, soldiers, and citizens, to navigate the space between them. To study this is to study humanity itself, our capacity for reason, our appetite for power, our instinct for survival, and our endless struggle to act rightly in a world that rarely makes it easy. Thanks for watching. If this gave you something to think about, Consider liking the video and subscribing for more content that explores these complex ideas. See you next time.